welcome to Lead Live, reminding you of your personal genius and how you think in order to actualize what you desire.
Hello, everyone. Happy Women's Herstory Month. I love that. History through the lens of women and girls. It's an honor to be here with you another Wednesday, noon Pacific Standard Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Wherever you're at on the globe, we love to be here in service to you and with you. Today, I have a special guest. Her name is Alicia, John-Baptiste. And the topic that we're going to discuss will be her journey. So we've named this particular broadcast, My Journey, Learning to Lead with Love. This is a very, I don't think she would say very, humble, I say very remarkable spirit. A woman who cares deeply, and demonstrates it in her work. And I'm reminded of someone that I don't think she'd compare herself to because she's sufficiently humble. It makes me think of Mackenzie Scott, who we're honoring as an organization this month because of her wiring to give and do it in such a way where she's not prominent. The organization is made much more prominent. Nonprofit organizations that are doing extraordinary things in support of families, communities, even businesses that serve families and communities, society at large. Well, Alicia strikes me as being wired in the same way. And I think that's why, in part, she's leading. Yet you don't have to worry about me and my thoughts. We get to hear from her directly. So before we introduce her directly, I'd like to introduce her indirectly by sharing just a short snippet of her bio. She's responsible for defining the overall vision and strategy for SPUR. It is a local, regional organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area with offices in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose, California. And literally, vision and strategy is so primary to an organization's success. As a seasoned leader and public policy professional, Alicia has over 20 years of experience reimagining systems to create better outcomes for people. Her optimistic vision and practical approach inform SPUR's efforts to build a Bay Area where all people can thrive. Prior to her time at SPUR, she developed deep appreciation for local government and its commitment to the collective good while serving in leadership roles for the city of San Francisco, the county of San Francisco, and prior to SPUR, as chief of staff for the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. Locally and nationally, she's recognized for her public policy expertise, inspirational perspective, and creative approach to systems change. This woman can start talking and in no time at all have a room of people collectively silenced to listen to the substance of what she shares that's all about the illuminations of the best of us and how we can leverage the right kinds of policies to get there. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So Alicia focuses her talents and experience on building shared dreams. She holds a master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's of arts degree from Duke University. She lives in Oakland, California with her remarkable family, her husband, twin children, and puppy Bowie. And she loves nothing more than traveling with 3 out of the 4 of them. I think you know the 3 I'm referring to. So now I'd like to ask Jet to have Alicia come into the studio. Bring her in. It's a pleasure. Hello, how are you?
Hi, Elnora. It's so great to be with you. Thank you for having me here today.
It's my honor. Thank you for making the time. And I know that you're extremely busy. So I'm deeply appreciative of you making the time to share with our viewing audience, those who are here with us live, and those who have an opportunity to see you by looking at the video later on. So I want to jump into this because I spent more time at the beginning, and I know that you're really into just sharing. And so first I want to ask you, what should we know about you that we would not find in social media?
Well, there's probably not a lot in social media because I'm a little media shy, to be honest. Things to know about me. I think one of the things that maybe is not so well known, but explains a lot about who I am, is that I grew up in a very complicated family structure. A lot of marriage, a lot of divorce, a lot of half step, former step, semi half siblings. And as a result of that, I have both a very small and a very large family, depending on how you cut it. And it just gave me a lot of exposure to all types of different people and families and configurations. And I think the understanding that at the end of the day, we can choose the tenor of our relationships. We can choose to say, this is part of my family, or we can choose not to. And my experience going through so much change in my family structure was ultimately that what felt healthiest to me was to choose the most inclusive form of family that I possibly could.
Mm.
And I think that's had some influence over just how I am in the world.
That's powerful. Makes me think about the questions I have and how your experiences, those experiences, your early childhood experiences, influenced who you are now. How did you learn to lead with love? Were there particular lessons that promoted this learning?
I think if I'm honest, I think it's an ongoing learning. I don't know that there's ever an end state to understanding how to lead with love, at least the way that I hold that. I think there were probably two sort of profound experiences that helped me to conceptualize this and helped me to understand what it feels like to lead with love. And one was probably in my early days when I was working for the city of San Francisco, and I was a new manager. I was a relatively new manager for an entire organization. And I think unconsciously, like so many of us, I had this image of what effective leadership looked like in my head, which was ultimately, I think, sort of a command and control image of, I will know that I'm doing well if I can do everything by myself. I need to have all of the answers, and I need to decide what people are going to do and then make sure that they do it. And what I found over time, I worked in this particular organization for about 8 years. And what I found over time was I could have everybody do the thing that I thought that they should be doing if I put a lot of energy into it and really stayed on top of kind of the real detailed aspects of what people were doing and how they were spending their time. But it was exhausting. And what it led to was I started to experiment with, well, what if I actually have a conversation early in the process with the people who ultimately need to be involved, where we actually define the problem together, and then we head towards what is the right way to approach it. And what I found was that in taking that approach, I didn't have to do so much work to carry things through. And also, sometimes we defined the problem differently than I thought we were going to at the outset. And it just started to get me thinking about the just sort of how dusty this concept of leadership is, that I think is in some ways dominant, and got me experimenting. And then I think the experience that I had that really kind of transitioned for me, was a big transition point into really embracing the concept of leading with love, was actually an experience that was outside of work. It was when my children were little. And so I have twins, you mentioned, and they're wonderful. They're 11 years old now. They're biracial. Their dad is Black. And when they started at their elementary school, they started to experience racism at school, both, from my perspective, institutionalized racism as well as interpersonal racism. And when it first started, they were about 6 years old. And I went to the school, very concerned about the experience that they were having. And not just concerned, I think, probably the right word is infuriated. I was enraged. I was so angry because these were my babies and they were experiencing harm. And the response that I got from the school was not satisfying to me. And so I started to think about, I started to put my energy into, how can I dismantle and in some ways destroy the leadership of this school, because it's not responding in the way that I think it needs to, and my children are in harm's way. And I started to talk to people who had been doing work on racial equity and on anti-racist practices for a really long time. And to a person, what they said to me was, you have to come at this with love for the leadership of the school. We will never get to the place we are trying to get to, in which each person is actually held sacred. Each person actually is seen for their inherent value. We will never get there if in our process we are not practicing that ourselves. Wow. So you have to go back to this person and repair the harm, because at that point I had caused harm, and come to this with love in your heart. And I trusted them, I trusted that wisdom. And as much as I have to be honest, I didn't necessarily want to approach it that way at the time with all the feelings that I had. I tried it and it worked. And it just was such a powerful lesson in understanding that when we are grappling with the really hard things that are ultimately, for me at least, at the core of what I want to contribute to the world, truly the only way to get there is with a tremendous amount of love and compassion and empathy. And it doesn't mean that we accept what is. Sometimes I think we have this idea of love as passive. And to me, it was much more that the love, finding the power behind that, the power to interrupt the existing kind of dynamics that were creating this harm. It's all, to me, it was all very much integrated.
Wow.
And so I've tried to hold that in my daily practice, since that experience. And, and as I said, I do think it's an ongoing journey. I can't say I show up as my best self every single day.
Well, when we say lead with love, what does that mean for you? Can you break it down?
I think, well, leadership is an interesting concept in and of itself. And, as I was saying, I think that in my early days, I thought that leadership was knowing what had to get done and then making sure that people did it. What I have learned over time, because now, I'm 25 years in, what I've learned over time is that leadership is actually a combination of being able to see where we need to be going, of being able to really have that clear line of sight into the vision, but then actually being responsible for bringing the people together to move towards that goal. And that is not the same thing as telling people what to do. It's
so
really
interesting. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna. I mean, it's just it is interesting because it's in some ways, I feel in my role that it's important to consistently articulate where we could be, where we should be going, but the how to get there, and even if the vision is, the part of the, I feel my responsibility is to ensure that the vision is inclusive, because also if people don't see themselves in the vision, it's probably not actually the right thing, because where we are trying to go is to a future that includes all of us. Mm. And so we all have to actually see ourselves in it.
Powerful. 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 So many thoughts I have. I'm going to stick with you instead of illuminating some of the things you've said, because you've said it sufficiently and adequately and brilliantly. So why leadership to begin with? Was there something you aimed to accomplish when you start off at the initial leadership role where you are responsible for influencing people?
I don't think that for me, leadership was ever the objective. Mm-hmm. I think that for me, it became the mechanism. Mm-hmm. And so what I remember is being very, very young and feeling very strongly that the way that we live together as a community, as human beings, mm-hmm. that there was something off about it, because there was and there continues to be so much suffering among us. Mm-hmm. And it always felt to me that it was unnecessary. That there is some, as I've gotten older, I think my perspective has changed a little bit. So, at this stage in my life, I believe we will likely always experience some level of suffering as human beings, because we love and we feel and we experience the world, and most of us will have a broken heart at some point in time. Almost all of us will lose somebody who we love and care for, and it hurts. And, there's a form of suffering that I think is innate to human existence. Mm. And the way that we have things set up in this country at this point in time is that we layer on top of that all these other elements of suffering, where, for example, we live in a region that doesn't have enough housing. And so 35,000 people live on the street. It's not necessary for people to live on the street. We could have enough housing. People could live in homes. When the pandemic hit, one of the things that a lot of the cities were grappling with was the explosion in hunger and food insecurity, because so many children and their families were being fed by the schools. And all of a sudden, that supply line got cut off. We have one of the biggest GDPs of any region in any nation in any point in time in history in the world. Mm-hmm. In this region here in the Bay Area, people don't need to be hungry. We have enough money for people to be fed. These are elements of suffering that we have allowed to exist, that we, through our inaction, perpetuate. And they're not necessary. And if we could shift the way that we live so that people could have access to the basics, the core elements of what allows somebody to feel secure and to have a baseline of stability, I cannot even imagine, I try, but I cannot even imagine what our world would be like if we got to that state. Just not even everybody rolling around in Mercedes. I'm talking about just people having the baseline elements of security and stability. I think we would unlock enormous potential.
Ah, you're giving me chills.
You can imagine it, right?
I can imagine aspects of it. The level of creativity that's embedded in each one of us is quite extraordinary. And we get to see just a little bit of it from time to time. And then we look at the whoever they are. I'm not even going to name folks because I don't want us to go and just focus on her or him. There are folks we tend to focus on. Oh my God, they're genius. They've done this brilliant stuff. They transform a whole industry. And yet I firmly agree with you. And I used to think it was my naivete. Now I understand. The more I learn, the more I know I don't know. Yet what I do know is the capacity will just be unleashed when our basic fundamental needs are met. And literally, I believe that people will take off in ways that will pay itself forward in society, in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment, in terms of families, neighborhoods, society at large, humanity. We have no idea. I agree wholeheartedly.
100%. And I also think that imagine the level of grace we could afford each other if we were all feeling secure. And we have such a fractured, we're so fractured right now. And so there's so much mistrust and there's so much, feeling of us versus them and fear and, all of it. Right. And I think we would find ourselves in a position where we would have less of that need to hurt each other if all of us actually just had the baseline of what we need.
Yeah, I'm showing my arms, which I rarely do because I don't know why I'm overly self-conscious about my body. So I always cover it. I just feel chills and I'm not warm by any clothes. So I'm just, there's chills up and there's little manifestations of it. I want to illuminate something you said earlier by revealing one of my nieces. She's remarkable. I'm so honored to have her as a niece along with my other nieces and nephews. Christian Dior writes, powerful, repair the harm that you've done. Know that love, emphasis on love, is not necessarily passive, yet understand it is extremely powerful for those expressing it, those receiving it, and those witnessing it. Yes, Christian. Yeah, honoring you, Alicia.
Thank you. Credit where credit is due. I mean, I think Martin Luther King spoke about this most eloquently of anybody I've ever seen, where he talks about the combination of power and love in service of justice. And that for me has been very, it's just been very directional. I've really leaned on his words in that regard too. I think going back to your question about why leadership, what I was describing before, that recognition that it doesn't have to be this way, for me has been, I don't know how to say it other than the only way that I could live with the feeling that it created inside of me was to work on it, to put my effort into doing things that would reduce suffering. And so I studied public policy because I thought to myself, well, we set up all these rules and then these rules have outcomes. And if we don't like the outcomes, we should change the rules. And I think that's public policy. And so I started to study public policy. And then I worked in government organizations. And what I found working in government organizations was that actually the starting point for reducing suffering oftentimes had to be within the organization itself, that there was a lot that we were doing internally that was creating harm just among the people who were then trying to deliver services to the people outside of the organization.
Point.
And so I think the path for me to leadership has actually just really, in some ways, been a very pragmatic calculation of in what seat can I do the most? And when I was working for the city, I loved working for the city. And I got to a point after almost 20 years, I think it was 16 years or so, where I thought, okay, it's not reaching enough people. The work I'm doing isn't reaching enough people. And, ultimately I went to work for SPUR because SPUR was inhabiting a more regional footprint. And so I wanted to be able to kind of take this work to a broader scale. So I think for me, it's mostly been about just wanting to amplify the work that I'm doing. I think there is an aspect for me too of feeling that I tend to have a bit of an empathetic approach that isn't always, common in leadership. And so I've also, I think, wanted to be able to try to be an example of leadership that is done with a little more empathy and, kind of moving away from that command and control style that I was describing earlier.
It's interesting when you described the command and control style earlier, not using that language in particular, but it made me think about how we have a tendency of breaking people. And because we're trying to control. It's that old factory model, right? That was used around the early 1900s, getting the widgets all through the line, and the widgets were people. Well, people are more than just, people are not widgets, first of all. And yet when we think management and we overlay that onto people, we do what you said you thought was the model of leadership. That's a way to break people. You manage things and you lead people. What does that mean? You guide them. And so one of the things that I value about you is, as you already articulated, you focus on articulating over and over and over this big vision. Everyone fits within the vision. People can take out their piece that works for them and support the organization accordingly, because they're part of it. And the vision is made prominent, not you're doing things my way or it's the highway model. It is, how do we collectively decide the best path to go? And I found in leadership, if it's collaborative, you're more likely to find out the barriers long before you actually walk into quicksand. The quicksand is there because someone in the group undoubtedly knows. And yet that person won't share it if he or she doesn't feel like that individual is part of the organization, meaning they don't fit in the vision. They have not been spoken with. They've not been heard. They've not been listened to. They've not been honored. And your wiring is to do just that. So when I ask you to define what you mean by lead, basically through love, you've described the leadership. Describe the love, because love is used a lot and it's thrown around a lot, and it means so many different things to different people. With almost 8 billion people on the planet, there could be 8 billion different definitions. So for you, what does love mean in the context of leading in a professional environment or in life broadly?
I think, I think the kind of the foundational understanding for me is an understanding that actually we are all connected. That actually, you are Elnora and I am Alicia, but in fact, we are connected. We are part of a community together. And so when we think about, what is the future that we're trying to create for this region, it's not a future that's Alicia's future. It's a future that is our collective future. And so, what it comes down to, I think what I often boil it down to is it has to work for all of us, or it works for none of us. And that is to me, that's an element of a really important component of my definition of love, is just that understanding that actually we are not separate. We are truly one. And it can take kind of sitting in your heart to integrate that understanding into kind of the day-to-day challenges that we grapple with. Because while that may be true, we also work in an environment where people have different agendas, and some people want to do things one way and other people think it's wrong and want to do it a different way. And we have these conflicts with each other. And so being able to kind of come back to a central principle of, while we are, because also the organization that I lead is one very focused on change, right? We are constantly trying to create change. And so where it comes back to for me is, while we are trying to create change, we are also trying to keep all of the people with whom we work whole. That we never want to win at the expense of destroying somebody else. That the changes that we look for can't create harm for other people. And so that's an element of what I mean when I say leading with love. It's a discipline, and it's sort of a constant reminder to look at everything from the vantage point of essentially the other, right? The entity with whom you're having conflict, or the resistance to what you're trying to achieve. What is that perspective, and how could we actually fold it in to what we are aiming to do?
I want to acknowledge M. Swags, who writes, "The way you helped is a clear demonstration of why you're a shining example in our city. You embody kindness, generosity, and so much more." Jamie Leverton. Thank you, Jamie. Yeah. And what came to mind when you were saying that? When you said that we are all one, and that is essential to your definition of love, I'm going to paraphrase and you correct me, because I love to be corrected when I'm wrong. And that is, because we're one, and because there is a desire to be the healthy you, who values you unconditionally. And so you develop and you maintain this unconditional love for yourself. And because you do, and you're part of everything, you feel this natural connection. You understand the natural connection to everything. You love everything. It is you. You need everything to be healthy. You need everything to be its remarkable, unique self. And so as such, you do things to edify that, to complement, to work to influence, to grow it. And that is essentially part of what you mean by leading through love, or leading with love. Is that correct?
I think that's right. And I the example that I often give, because it's one that it's an experience that so many people have. When we think about our personal well-being. So, I am very fortunate. I live in a lovely part of Oakland. I have a healthy family. When I walk out my front door, I see trees. It's a nice place to be. Within a few minutes of leaving my home, I will come across somebody who is living in the park, or on the street, or under other circumstances, who is clearly suffering. And the fact that I live in a home that gives me security and the ability to be restored when I'm at home isn't actually enough to secure my personal well-being. The only way that my well-being is whole is if the person who is suffering on the street is taken out of that situation, is able to also have personal well-being. Because we are so connected, I can't separate myself from the experience that that other person is having. It's part of my experience. And so when we think about what we are trying to accomplish and why, there is that element of recognizing that interconnectedness that I think actually most people have that experience of deep discomfort, pain, grief, actually, of witnessing the suffering of others in their community. I'm just thinking there's another part of love, which, and this goes back to the Martin Luther King reference, but there is another part of love, which is a demand for justice. That, again, it is not just about recognizing our interconnectedness or trying to improve, my personal well-being by making sure that the community is well off. It's actually that when we lead with love, we understand that there is a baseline of acceptable, and also there is unacceptable. And the experience that so many people in our community have of not actually being safe, particularly people of color, is unacceptable. And this component of love demands that we change it. It demands that we create different conditions, because inherently people are valuable. Every single person shares the same inherent value. And so our recognition of that, and I think that's another sort of foundational definition for me of love itself, is that recognition. To lead with love, if we recognize that that is true, then love requires us to act in service of justice. And it's I think I spoke earlier about love not being passive. It's, to me, part of the part of the power that sits with this concept is it's active, actually. It is demanding and working towards that better future, and that better future is one that is just.
Wow. All folks benefit from hearing what you're sharing. And all folks have their different experiences and interpretations, certainly, of what you're sharing. And in the way that we want our girls and women to understand their importance and how they lead, we want our young boys and men to do the same. We need all of us to lead with our own level of personal genius and distinction in a way that's healthy, that's honorable, that adds value. When you speak to, I'd like for you to speak to the importance of leadership among girls and women in particular. And as part of honoring Women's History Month or Her Story Month, just independent of March, just any time of the year, why are girls and women essential right now on this planet, in all of our households, in our neighborhoods, impacting us globally, nationally, locally? Why?
I mean, we're half the population. We matter. We matter. We're half the population. And I think that there is a particular perspective that women of all backgrounds bring to leadership, to activism, to any environment, which is very few things have actually been designed for us. And in having the experience of navigating systems, places, cultures, work environments that were not designed for us, it's easier for us to see what is not designed for others. And therefore, because we never assume that it was designed for us. We never assume that it's actually set up the way that it should be. And so it gives us the capacity to, when we step forward and say, this is how I need to be able to show up, we create space for those systems, cultures, environments, places to flex to everybody. And it's important that we come forward to do that. I've been seeing this dynamic playing out, with the pandemic. So a lot of people started working from home. It changed the whole nature of how we were managing our households and also how we were relating to work, et cetera. And now many people are in the process of returning. And for myself, I'll just give my own personal example. So when we first went into lockdown and everything was shut down, all you could do, the only thing we could really do was go for a walk, from my memory. And so I was going on walks with my kids. They weren't in school. I wasn't at work. I mean, we were doing school and work, but virtually. We were going for walks, 2 or 3 times a day. And on one of those walks, my daughter, who was 9 at the time, said to me, the only good thing about lockdown is that now we get to see you. Because prior to the pandemic, my work schedule was such that I left before they were awake in the morning, and I came home, and about an hour later, they went to bed. So I saw them for an hour a day, 5 days a week. And, then we had the weekends. And what I recognized was how painful that was for them as my children, and also how painful it was for me. And what a loss it was to not be able to be with 2 of my favorite people on the planet, and as their mother, And so as we have been navigating, all the sort of rules got suspended. And so now we're in this moment of redefining what the rules are going to be. And so as we're coming back into this, the principle that I am holding, and because I sit in the seat that I do, I get to make this a principle for my organization. The principle that I'm holding is I will have an integrated life. I will have a life in which my children get to be present, and I get to be a mother as well as a CEO. Those 2 things have to be able to coexist. And so we're going to set the rules so that they can. And the truth is that there are plenty of fathers who also want to have that experience. So when we set these different parameters, when we show up and say, it doesn't work this way, it needs to be different, it's not benefiting only us, it's benefiting typically everybody. The other thing I'll offer, because this just happened recently, I watched a transit documentary that I had participated in, and I'd seen it once before, but the second time that I watched it, I realized that it was the story of transit in San Francisco. And I realized that it was actually partly a story of women's resistance, that the fact that there are not as many freeways in San Francisco as there would otherwise have been during the freeways movement was because of the resistance of women. The fact that the cable cars still run in San Francisco was because of the resistance of women. And the resistance and advocacy was always geared towards protecting the community,
Mm.
holding the integrity of the community, nurturing and safeguarding the community. And that is a role that we play in society. And that voice is so essential.
Mm. Powerful. Powerful. What's a message you would want to share with girls, including teenagers, who are in this world that is, I don't even know, I can't even imagine what they're thinking. I hear some of them because I hear some nieces and nephews, but I don't know fully what they're thinking. They're probably looking at us and saying, wow, these adults are strange. They didn't get it right.
I think the message that I would share is you are already okay.
Mm.
You are already okay. The noise about who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to look like and how you're supposed to behave and how you're supposed to show up on social media and what you're supposed to do at school and, you know, how you're supposed to have friends or whatever it is, it's noise. You are already okay. You were born into this world with a unique set of powers and skills and perspective. And actually, all that you need to do is to bring that forward. You do not need to conform to anything else. It is about bringing your uniqueness forward. That's what we all need. That's what I hope for from the next generation. I want to see them all shine in their own uniqueness.
I love it. I feel the need to ask you to talk more specifically about the role that SPUR has. If you could speak to its explicit vision, mission, and how it expects to influence the region and beyond.
For sure. So SPUR is an urban policy organization, long-standing, has for a long time done a lot of work in the realm of urban policy and urban planning. And we recently published essentially a strategy. We called it the regional strategy, where we asked the question, if we want the Bay Area to be a place that is equitable, that is environmentally sustainable, that has shared prosperity, going out 50 years from now, what needs to be done in order to make that happen? And so we analyzed a bunch of stuff and figured out, okay, these are the various changes that we need to make from a policy standpoint in order to achieve that future. And so the work that we do is really in trying to, from a very practical standpoint, build that future Bay Area that so many of us aspire to. And one of the central questions that we asked through that process was, what does it take to create a Bay Area in which all people get to belong? Because you can have a prosperous region, you can have a sustainable region, but you could also have a very homogenous region, right? And so how do we build a place where actually everybody gets to be here by choice, by birth, whatever it is? So the work that we are doing now is really in trying to take some of the big component parts of that, you know, what it will take to get to that vision and move it into action. So we have a whole body of work that we're doing around making a housing affordable, which is in part building enough housing and in part making sure that we have proper tenant protections, that we have the right kinds of subsidies to create affordable housing. We're also doing a body of work on transportation. There's a transition to the way that we move around that we know needs to happen to make it more sustainable. Doing a lot of work on climate change and climate adaptation, and doing a lot of work on economic justice as well. Asking the question, how do we make sure that within the broad prosperity of the Bay Area, we actually invest in the services that support all of us, and we invest in our people to make sure that people here actually have the kinds of opportunities that they deserve.
Awesome. Awesome. You already touched on the last question that I was going to illuminate, and it's about the commonality that we share. And that is rooted in your understanding of our interconnectedness. What's a takeaway, if you will, as we near the end of this discussion, that you would like people to just hold and reflect on, and even whether it's embrace or do something about, that is related to the commonality that we share? What is the big takeaway from your humble perspective?
You know, there's a practice that I think we all can do, which, because sometimes we get overwhelmed when we start to think about, I mean, how does any one person solve homelessness, right? And it can become sort of depressing and paralyzing, actually, when we think about these really big challenges, how to go about them. But the practice that I think we all can do is when you see somebody who is different than you, in the coffee shop, walking down the street, on your way to work, whatever, wherever it might be, right? In the grocery store, when you see somebody who is different than you, to ask yourself the question, how are we similar? How are we actually, how are we connected? How are we the same? How are we similar? How are we connected? What's my first assumption about this person, and what else might be true about them? Like, just sort of start to create a curiosity around the other people in our communities. And I think in just practicing that over and over again, we start to create the awareness and the understanding of our connection. And that actually there's a lot more that binds us than keeps us apart.
I love that. And I'm always reminded, for whatever reason, I come up in my head, what comes up is we're almost 100% identical biologically. And most folks don't even know that. We're over 99.9 something percent identical. And what makes you and me and others them, or those individuals, the individuals, it's just a small, not even a percent. And yet that difference is beautiful to be honored. And the genuine biological sameness is to be honored. And how do we bridge the gap? And this is a rhetorical question, so it's not a fair question to ask you or anyone else. And you may want to speak to it. How do we, and I think you've already spoken to it with your one example, but how do we bridge the divide that has been artificially contrived? And not just artificially contrived in terms of systems that are in place, yet artificially contrived based upon the politics, based upon the economic agendas of particular individuals, based upon the core set of values of particular individuals. How do we bridge that to neutralize the unnecessary nonsense that's in the space that occupies too much space between and among folks?
That's the work. I think that's the work. I think we get to this bright future when we can understand that actually we're already connected.
You know why I'm smiling. And I want the viewing audience to be clear. I'm smiling because it's a shared understanding that Alicia and I have had. And I remember one of my brothers when we were kids. I don't know if he remembers it. I think I was 7 and he might have been 6. or 5.5, because he's a little bit younger than that. Ernesto or Ernie, I don't know if he's watching this, but I'll never forget, we had this conversation about the oneness of all things. And we hadn't read it. We hadn't seen a television program. In fact, arguably, one could say, oh, we were going into our little worlds because we were in a harmful environment. Whatever. We were clear that we were connected to everything that is, was, will be, and likewise, everything is connected to us. There's just interconnectedness of everything. And we used to muse about it just as kids. And we had these rather rigorous conversations as though we were giving a presentation to one another and anyone else listening, any spiritual entity. And then, you know, I go out into the world, get older, and look to have similar understandings with folks and realize people look at me strange and like, what excuse me, what are you talking about? Are you okay? And it's because I think that something in our, I don't know, that we put in the water, that we put in the chemicals we put in the food, the toxins we put in the air, whatever, the messages we put out there leads us to believe that we have to be at different ends of the spectrum. And it's okay to have different sets of values. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's only wrong when it harms. So it's okay to have different visions for our lives. In fact, it's complementary to have diversity. We benefit from that. We are diverse inherently. Yet there's something pulling at us. I think pulling me forward to say, you've got to do more of this. And that's why you're here, Alicia, because you live this. And you're not just here because we happen to agree. In fact, I have people on here I don't agree with sometimes. It's not about agreeing. It's about having some fundamental understandings that are the underpinning of our leadership that drive us to do greater good for the rest of us. And I think that's our power. That's part of our superpower. And I want to encourage girls, young women, older women, and elders. Do what Alicia said. Be your authentic self. You can't go wrong. In fact, we need you to be that authentic you. This society, this planet, oh my goodness, in all spaces, we don't need you to be a carbon copy of something or someone else, and definitely not to mirror a man. A man is a man for a reason. A woman is a woman for a reason. Be the powerful woman you are, girl you are, young, developing woman you are. Alicia, I want to thank you for being here. And more importantly, I want to thank you for leading and choosing to lead in a way where many of us want to follow. You're not leading so that you have followers. You're leading so all of us can be in partnership with you, right? Side by side with you in order to transform conditions for the greater good.
Thank you so much, Elnora. It's been such a pleasure to be talking to you. Thank you.
We have another comment among a few others. I don't understand the others. I'm going to put this one up. Love the concept of diverting focus away from differences to place more emphasis on similarities in honor of understanding our connectedness. Yes. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Any last words you'd like to share?
I just really appreciate you. I hope you know that. Thank you for this. It's really been wonderful.
I honor you. And thank you all for viewing, for leveraging. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday, Lead Live. Most importantly, live you. Live with joy. Live with as much happiness as you choose to have, experience. And know that when you have challenges, they're just preconditions to the success that you're aiming for. Leverage them to your advantage. Wado.